Rome, July 10, 1973, 3 a.m. The heat of the Italian summer hangs heavy over the cobblestones of the Piazza Farnese. The city is asleep, but the shadows are awake. In the center of the square, the fountains are silent. The air smells of stale wine, exhaust fumes, and jasmine. A young man walks alone. He is 16 years old. He has a mess of curly red hair, a shirt unbuttoned to his navel, and a beaded necklace rattling against his chest. He is handsome in a wild, reckless way. He looks like a Renaissance angel who has fallen into a vat of cheap whiskey. His name is John Paul Getty III. To the locals, he is the golden hippie. To the tabloids, he is the heir to the greatest fortune the world has ever known. But tonight, he has no bodyguards. He has no limousine. He has 10,000 liras in his pocket and a half-empty pack of cigarettes. He is drunk on the freedom of being young, rich, and untouchable in the eternal city. But he is not untouchable. A white van idles in the alleyway. The engine purrs, a low mechanical growl. As Paul passes a darkened doorway, the air shifts. Hard rubber soles slap against the stone. 3 men emerge from the darkness. They don't look like the polished mobsters of the movies. They smell of garlic, sweat, and cheap tobacco. They are Calabrians, mountain men, wolves in human skin. Before Paul can scream, a burlap sack is thrown over his head. The rough fabric scratches his face. The smell of the sack is suffocating, dust and earth. A hard fist connects with his stomach, folding him in half. He is dragged, kicking and thrashing, into the back of the van. The doors slam shut. The lock clicks. And just like that, the grandson of the richest man in human history vanishes from the face of the earth. As the van speeds away toward the rugged mountains of the south, Paul believes with the naive certainty of a child that this will be over soon. He believes his grandfather, the great J. Paul Getty, the emperor of oil, the man who owns the world, will simply write a check. He believes that money is a shield. He is wrong. He is about to discover that his last name is not a shield. It is a target. He is about to learn that the man who sits on the throne of the House of Getty does not operate by the laws of love or family or human decency. He operates by the cold, hard laws of the ledger. For 5 months, that boy will rot in a cave. He will be chained to a stake like a dog. He will lose his ear. He will lose his mind. And all the while, his grandfather will sit in a Tudor mansion in England, surrounded by Alsatian guard dogs and priceless paintings, refusing to pay a single dime, calculating the tax implications of his grandson's life. This is not just a crime story. This is a tragedy of biblical proportions. It is the story of a bloodline infected by greed. It is the story of what happens when you extract so much wealth from the earth that you hollow out your own soul. This is the dark story of the Getty estate. Chapter 1: The Methodist and the Monster. To understand the darkness that consumed the grandson in 1973, we must go back 70 years to the freezing, windswept plains of the Oklahoma Territory. In 1903, oil is a dirty business. Today, we think of it as clean gas pumps and plastic credit cards. But in the beginning, it was mud, blood, and fire. It was a gamble that attracted the most desperate and depraved men in America. Into this chaos walked a man named George Getty. George was an anomaly. He was a Minneapolis lawyer, a devout Methodist, a man of God in a land of sinners. He didn't drink. He didn't smoke. He didn't curse. He looked at the oil fields not as a casino, but as a test of faith. He believed that God had placed the oil under the ground, and that God would guide the righteous man to find it. He formed the Minahoma Oil Company, and as if the Almighty was indeed guiding his hand, he struck black gold almost immediately. The Minahoma well came in roaring. George Getty became a millionaire. But George had a problem. It wasn't the oil, it was his son. Jean-Paul Getty, born in 1892, was the dark mirror image of his father. Where George was pious, Paul was predatory. Where George was faithful, Paul was insatiable. From the moment he could speak, Paul Getty possessed a cold, calculating intelligence that unnerved even his own parents. He didn't care about God. He cared about winning. As a young man, Paul attended Oxford University in England. He adopted the affectations of an aristocrat. He learned to speak French and German. He developed a taste for tailored suits, fine wine, and other men's wives. He was a libertine, prowling the ballrooms of Europe, treating women with the same detached curiosity he applied to geology. In 1914, George Getty decided to test his son. He gave the 24-year-old Paul a small stake of money and sent him to Oklahoma. He hoped the hard work of the oil fields would break the boy's vanity. He hoped the mud would humble him. He was wrong. The mud didn't humble Paul, it unleashed him. Paul Getty arrived in Oklahoma wearing a three-piece suit. The roughnecks laughed at him. But Paul had an instinct that defied logic. He looked at a piece of land called the Nancy Taylor allotment. It was a patch of scrubland that every other oilman had dismissed as dry. The geology looked wrong. The price was too low. Paul bought the lease for $500. 2 weeks later, the drill bit smashed into a reservoir of high-grade crude. The well produced 700 barrels a day. In 2 years, that $500 investment turned into a fortune. By the time he was 24, J. Paul Getty had made his first $1 million. Most young men would have celebrated. Paul just wanted more. The relationship between father and son began to rot. George Getty watched his sons rise with horror. He saw Paul marrying and divorcing women at a dizzying pace. He saw Paul fathering children he barely visited. He saw a man who treated human beings like disposable drilling bits, useful until they broke, then discarded. When George Getty lay on his deathbed in 1930, the Great Depression was ravaging the world. George looked at his empire and he looked at his son. He made a decision that was intended to be a final lesson in humility, but instead became the catalyst for a century of pain. George left an estate worth $10 million, a staggering sum in 1930, but he didn't leave it to Paul. He left Paul a mere $500,000. The rest went to Paul's mother, Sarah, with strict instructions. Do not let Paul control this money. He will destroy it, and he will destroy himself. It was a slap in the face from beyond the grave. George thought he was clipping his son's wings, but he didn't understand the nature of the creature he had raised. Paul didn't react with shame. He reacted with a cold, nuclear rage. He looked at his father's will and saw it as a challenge. He vowed, standing over his father's fresh grave, that he would not just surpass the old man. He would dwarf him. He would build an empire so large that his father's $10 million would look like pocket change. He would prove that the sinner could out-earn the saint. Chapter 2. The Predator in the Ruins. The 1930s, the Great Depression. The spine of the American economy had snapped. Wall Street was a graveyard. Men in silk suits were jumping out of windows. Families were packing their lives into jalopies and heading west, fleeing the Dust Bowl. For 99% of the world, it was hell. For J. Paul Getty, it was a buffet. This is where the true genius and the true darkness of Getty revealed itself. He was a contrarian predator. His philosophy was simple and terrifying. Buy when everyone else is selling and hold until everyone else is buying. While other tycoons were panicking, trying to save their companies, Getty went on a shopping spree. He saw that oil stocks were trading for pennies. Companies that owned millions of barrels of reserves were being valued at less than the cash in their registers. It was irrational. It was a fire sale of the Earth's resources. He bought Pacific Western Oil. He bought Mission Corporation. He launched a brutal, hostile takeover of Tidewater Oil. He moved through the boardrooms of America like a shark in a wading pool. He didn't care about the legacy of these companies. He didn't care about the employees. He cared about the assets. He famously said, "The meek shall inherit the earth, but not the mineral rights." By the end of the 1940s, Getty had consolidated a massive domestic empire, but it wasn't enough. He looked at the map of the world and saw that the real game was not in Texas or Oklahoma. The real game was in the Middle East. At that time, the Middle East oil supply was locked down by the Seven Sisters, the massive conglomerates like Exxon, Mobil, and Shell. They controlled the flow. They controlled the price. They controlled the governments. Getty was an outsider, a wildcatter. The Seven Sisters viewed him as a nuisance, but Getty saw a crack in their armor. There was a piece of land known as the Neutral Zone. It was a barren, hellish strip of desert between Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. It was a geopolitical no-man's land. The heat was unbearable, 120 degrees in the shade, and there was no shade. The Seven Sisters had surveyed it and dismissed it. They said it was dry. They said it was a graveyard for drills. Getty saw an opportunity. In 1949, he approached King Ibn Saud of Saudi Arabia. He made an offer that the establishment considered suicidal. He offered $9.5 million in cash, up front, plus a guaranteed royalty of $1 million a year, just for the rights to drill in this barren wasteland. The industry laughed. They called it Getty's folly. They whispered that the old man had finally lost his mind. He was throwing $10 million into a hole in the sand. For 4 years, the laughter seemed justified. Getty poured money into the Neutral Zone. He built roads, he built camps, he shipped in massive rigs, and for 4 years, nothing. Dust, dry holes, broken machinery. The heat was so intense, it melted the tires of the trucks. The flies were so thick, they coated the faces of the workers like a living mask. 4 years, $30 million gone. But Getty refused to stop. He was possessed. He sat in his office in Paris reading the geological reports, convinced that the establishment was wrong. Then came 1953. The drill bit at a site called Wafra No. 4 hit a layer of Eocene limestone at 3,500 feet. The ground began to tremble. A low rumble, like a subway train approaching from deep within the earth, shook the rig. And then it happened. A geyser of crude oil exploded into the sky. It wasn't just a well, it was a monster. The Wafra field was one of the largest reservoirs of oil ever discovered. It didn't produce thousands of barrels, it produced millions. Overnight, the laughter stopped. The math of J. Paul Getty's wealth became impossible to comprehend. The oil from the Neutral Zone didn't trickle in, it flooded in. The profit margins were grotesque. It cost him pennies to extract a barrel that he could sell for dollars. In 1957, Fortune magazine published its inaugural list of the wealthiest people in America. The public expected the top spot to be held by a Rockefeller or a Ford or a Mellon. Instead, looking out from the cover was the dour, unsmiling face of J. Paul Getty. The article estimated his fortune at over $1 billion in 1957 money. In today's terms, he was richer than Bezos, richer than Musk. He was a sovereign state disguised as a human being. But the article revealed something else. It revealed that this new king of capitalism was a ghost. He lived out of suitcases in European hotels. He had no home. He had no friends. He was a solitary figure moving through the world with a ledger in one hand and a suitcase in the other. The world was fascinated. Who was this man? They were about to find out that the richest man in the world was also the most miserable. Chapter 3. The Fortress of Solitude. With the world watching him, Getty decided he needed a headquarters. He didn't return to America. He hated the taxes and he hated the society. He bought a property in England called Sutton Place. Sutton Place was a 16th century Tudor manor house. It was massive, drafty, and imposing. It had 72 rooms, 14 bathrooms, and was surrounded by 1,000 acres of pristine parkland. It was a house built for a duke, for grand parties and warmth. Under Getty, it became a fortress of paranoia and penny pinching. He surrounded the estate with high walls topped with barbed wire. He hired a security force of former SAS soldiers. He bought a pack of Alsatian dogs, vicious, trained killers that roamed the grounds at night. He put signs on the gates that read, "Danger, guard dogs." Inside, the mansion was a museum of his eccentricities. He filled it with priceless art, Rembrandts, Renoir, antique French furniture. But he treated the house like a cheap motel. The heating was rarely turned on. Guests would complain of seeing their breath in the hallways. Getty, wearing 3 sweaters, would simply say that the cold was good for the constitution. He would sit at the end of a 60-foot dining table, eating simple, bland food, chewing each bite 33 times because he believed it aided digestion. But the most infamous symbol of his sickness, the detail that would define his legacy forever, was the payphone. Shortly after moving in, Getty noticed that the contractors, renovators, and even his own guests were making long-distance calls on the mansion's telephones. They were calling London. They were calling New York. For a man making $1 million a day, these phone bills were less than a rounding error. They were microscopic, but to Getty, it was theft. It was a violation of his property. He called the British Post Office and had a standard coin-operated paybox installed in the main cloakroom of the mansion. He put padlocks on the dials of all the other phones in the house. Imagine the scene. You are a guest of the richest man on earth. You are sipping vintage wine in a room filled with $10 million of art. You ask to call your wife to tell her you arrived safely. The butler directs you to a closet under the stairs, where you have to fumble for coins and feed them into a slot like you are at a bus station. It was a power move. It was a psychological weapon. It told everyone who entered Sutton Place, "I give nothing, you take nothing. Every interaction here is a transaction." And the transactions extended to his personal life. Getty didn't have a wife at Sutton Place. He had a harem. He lived with a rotating cast of aristocratic European women. There was the Duchess, the Countess, the art curator. These were women of high society, fallen on hard times or seeking the thrill of proximity to power. They lived in the mansion, vying for his favor. It was a cold war of affection. Getty would pit them against each other. He would promise to update his will in their favor if they pleased him. He would punish them with silence if they annoyed him. He famously wrote in his diary, grading his sexual performance and the enthusiasm of his partners as if he were grading an oil well's output. He took massive amounts of vitamins. He experimented with H3, a drug rumored to reverse aging. He dyed his hair a frightening shade of reddish-brown. He underwent a facelift that went wrong, leaving him with a permanent frozen grimace. He was a man terrified of death, terrified of poverty, and terrified of love. And no one felt this terror more than his son children. Chapter 4, The Sacrificial Sons. J. Paul Getty had 5 sons from 5 different marriages: George, Jean Ronald, Eugene, who became Paul Jr., Gordon, and Timothy. To Getty, these were not children. They were potential successors and therefore potential disappointments. He treated them with a toxic mixture of neglect and impossible expectation. He wanted them to be ruthless businessmen. When they showed emotion, he crushed them. When they failed, he humiliated them. The tragedy of Timmy is the most heartbreaking chapter of the 1950s. Timmy was his youngest son, born to his wife, Teddy Lynch. Timmy was a sweet, gentle boy who adored his father, but Timmy was sick. He developed a brain tumor at a young age. He went blind. The surgeries were brutal and endless. During the years of Timmy's suffering, J. Paul Getty was in Europe negotiating the neutral zone deal. He refused to come home. He wrote letters to Teddy, not offering comfort, but complaining about the doctor bills. He scrutinized the invoices for his dying son's care, asking if cheaper alternatives were available. When Timmy finally died at the age of 12, asking for his father until the very end, Getty did not attend the funeral. He claimed he was too busy with business. He sent a note. This was the message sent to the surviving sons. You are a line item. Do not become a liability. His eldest son, George, tried the hardest to survive the system. George was the golden boy. He did everything right. He went to the right schools. He worked in the family business. He tried to be the son his father wanted, but Paul was relentless. He would fly into a rage if George made a minor error. He would undercut George in meetings. He would humiliate him in front of the board. George spent his life trying to climb a mountain that kept growing taller. In 1973, the pressure became too much. George locked himself in a room in his Los Angeles home. He consumed a lethal cocktail of barbiturates and alcohol. In a final, horrific act of despair, he stabbed himself in the stomach with a barbecue fork. It was a suicide born of absolute crushing emptiness. When told of his eldest son's suicide, J. Paul Getty's reaction was one of annoyance. He complained to a friend that George had been inconsiderate to leave the company in a lurch. He worried about who would run the Los Angeles office. Then there was Eugene, known as Paul Jr. Paul Jr. saw what happened to George. He saw the coldness, and he ran. He changed his name. He moved to Rome. He grew his hair long. He befriended the Rolling Stones. He started doing heroin. He rejected the business. Getty cut him off. He viewed Paul Jr. as a weakling, a drug addict, a disgrace to the name. He severed the financial lifeline. And it was this estrangement, this broken link between the king in England and the prince in Rome, that set the stage for the wolves. Chapter 5. The Snatch. We return to Rome, July 1973. The kidnappers have the boy. They drive him deep into the Aspromonte Mountains in Calabria. This is a primordial landscape, dense forests, limestone caves, deep ravines. It is a place where the Italian state has no power. They chain John Paul Getty III to a stake in a cave. The conditions are medieval. It is freezing at night. The cave crawls with rats and spiders. The boy is given only scraps of food. He is terrified. He cries for his mother. He cries for his grandfather. 2 days after the snatch, the phone rings at his mother Gail's apartment in Rome. A voice thick with a Calabrian accent says, "We have your son." The demand is simple, $17 million. To the kidnappers, this is a logical number. They have done the math. The grandfather is worth billions. 17 million is what he earns in a week. They assume the check will be written within the hour, but they don't know J. Paul Getty. Gail calls her ex-husband Paul Jr. He is a broke addict living in a haze of drugs in London. He doesn't have $17, let alone 17 million. They call the grandfather at Sutton Place. They beg. They plead. They have Paul. They are going to kill him. Please. J. Paul Getty listens. There is a silence on the line. And then he delivers the sentence that will shock the world. "I have 14 other grandchildren," he says, his voice flat and steady. "If I pay 1 penny now, I'll have 14 kidnapped grandchildren." He hangs up. The press goes wild. The headlines scream, "Richest man in world refuses to save grandson." Reporters camp outside the gates of Sutton Place. They stick microphones in his face. "Mr. Getty, are you really going to let him die?" Getty stands firm. He frames it as a moral stance. He talks about not negotiating with terrorists. He talks about setting a precedent. But privately, in the cold halls of Sutton Place, the reasoning is different. He writes in his diary about the boy. He wonders if the kidnapping is a hoax. He wonders if the boy is in on it, trying to squeeze money out of him. Even with his grandson's life on the line, His first instinct is that he is being scammed. He refuses to be the fool. He refuses to part with his capital. Chapter 6. The Ear and the Ledger. Summer turns to autumn. The leaves fall in Rome. In the mountains, the first snows begin to drift into the cave. The boy is rotting. He has lost 30 pounds. He has pneumonia. His captors are getting nervous. They thought this would be quick. Now they are stuck with a dying hostage and a grandfather made of stone. They decide to escalate. They need to prove they are serious. They need to send a piece of the boy to the old man. On a freezing morning in November, the kidnappers grab Paul. They hold him down. They give him a shot of brandy to numb the pain, but it doesn't work. One man holds his head against a rock. Another takes a serrated knife. The scream echoes through the mountains. They slice off his right ear. They put the ear in an envelope along with a lock of his red hair and a note. The note reads, "This is Paul's ear. If we don't get some money within 10 days, then the other ear will arrive. In other words, he will arrive in little bits." Because of a strike by the Italian Postal Service, the envelope is delayed. It sits in a sorting facility for weeks. When it finally arrives, at the offices of a Roman newspaper, the ear is shriveled. It is black. It looks like a piece of dried fruit. The photo of the severed ear is splashed across the front pages of every newspaper on Earth. It is a gruesome, barbaric image. It is proof that the nightmare is real. The public pressure on J. Paul Getty becomes unbearable. Even the Queen of England is rumored to be horrified. He can no longer claim it is a hoax. He agrees to negotiate. But this is where the story descends from tragedy into absolute grotesque absurdity. Getty doesn't just pay. He sends an ex-CIA agent named Fletcher Chase to Italy to haggle. He treats the ransom negotiation like a business deal. The kidnappers want $17 million. Getty offers nothing. The kidnappers drop to $5 million as Getty counters. They go back and forth, haggling over the value of the boy's life, while the boy bleeds in a cave. Finally, the kidnappers, exhausted and desperate, agree to a rock-bottom price, $3.2 million. Getty looks at the number. He calls his accountants. He asks a specific question. How much of this is tax-deductible? The lawyers run the numbers. They tell him that under U.S. tax law, he can write off $2.2 million as a theft loss, but the remaining $1 million would be considered a personal gift, and therefore subject to taxes. Getty refuses to pay the extra $1 million. He tells his son, Paul Jr., "I will pay the $2.2 million. The rest is up to you." Paul Jr. screams at him, "I don't have the money. You know I don't have the money." So J. Paul Getty makes a counteroffer to his own son. He says, "I will lend you the remaining $800,000 to save your son, but you must sign a contract. You must pay me back, and I will charge you 4% interest per annum." Let that sink in. The man who sits on a throne of oil, the man who wipes his mouth with millions, charged his destitute son interest on a loan to save his grandson from being butchered. He turned the ransom of his own flesh and blood into a profit-generating instrument. The contract is signed. The money is paid. On December 15, 1973, John Paul Getty III is found at a gas station in the countryside. He is shivering, missing an ear, malnourished, and traumatized. He is driven to the police station. His mother rushes to hold him. She weeps. Later that day, the boy asks to call his grandfather. He wants to thank him. He wants to hear the voice of the man who saved him. The boy dials the number for Sutton Place. The phone rings. J. Paul Getty refuses to pick up. He tells the butler he is busy. He never speaks to the boy again. Chapter 7. The Living Death. The story does not have a happy ending. There is no redemption arc. The boy who came back from the mountain was broken. The terror of the cave had wired itself into his brain. He tried to live a normal life. He married. He had a son. But the darkness was always there, whispering. He turned to the only medicine he knew: drugs, heavy drugs, heroin, cocaine, alcohol. He needed to obliterate his consciousness. In 1981, 8 years after the kidnapping, Paul III took a massive overdose of Valium, methadone, and alcohol. The cocktail stopped his heart. By the time paramedics revived him, his brain had been starved of oxygen for too long. He suffered a massive stroke. He woke up a quadriplegic. He was nearly blind. He could not speak. He was trapped in a body that was a cage, just like the cave had been a cage. For the next 30 years, until his death in 2011, the golden hippie sat in a wheelchair, being spoon-fed, trapped in the silence of his own mind. And the grandfather, J. Paul Getty, died in 1976, 3 years after the kidnapping. He died of heart failure at Sutton Place. He died alone. When his body was flown back to California to be buried at the Getty Villa, there were no throngs of weeping citizens. There were no eulogies from world leaders. There was just a small, uncomfortable gathering of the family he had tormented. Then came the reading of the will. The harem gathered, expecting millions. They received almost nothing. Some received small monthly stipends that would barely cover their rent. The sons gathered, expecting finally to inherit the empire they had suffered for. They received pittance. J. Paul Getty left the vast majority of his $4 billion fortune, the largest private fortune in history, to a trust. He ordered that the money be used to build a museum. He decided that oil paintings, marble statues, and French tapestries were more worthy of his care than his own children. He built a mausoleum of culture to scrub his name clean. He wanted to be remembered as a Medici, a patron of the arts, a man of taste. Chapter 8: The Zombie Empire. Today, if you visit Los Angeles, you cannot escape the name: the Getty Center, the Getty Villa, Getty Images. The name is synonymous with high culture, with beauty, with the preservation of history. You take a tram up the mountain to the Getty Center. It is a secular cathedral. The white travertine stone glows in the California sun. The gardens are geometric perfection. The silence is profound. But as you walk through those halls, looking at the Van Goghs and the Turners, you must remember what paid for them. Every brick in that building is cemented with the misery of a family. Every statue was bought with the profits of the neutral zone, extracted by men dying in the heat. The silence of the museum is not the silence of peace. It is the silence of a phone that was never answered. The Getty curse continued. The family has been plagued by overdoses, depression, and scandal for decades. The money acted like a radioactive element. It gave them power, but it poisoned their blood. The dark story of the Getty estate is not just a history lesson. It is a warning. We live in a world that worships wealth. We look at the billionaires of today, the tech moguls, the tycoons, and we envy them. We imagine that if we had that money, we would be happy. We would be safe. But J. Paul Getty proves us wrong. He had all the money in the world. He conquered the earth. He defeated his rivals. But in the end, he was a man who lived in a cold house, washing his own underwear, terrified of paying for a phone call. He was a man who could buy anything except the love of a child. He proved with brutal efficiency that you can own the world and still die poor.